Bilingual babies. What a fascinating topic. So language is our unique capacity as humans. Lots of other animals have vocalization systems or communication systems, but no other animal can communicate with the complexity that we do, with creating new sentences, new ideas all the time, with changing civilization and our understanding through language. And it's remarkable how rapidly language acquisition begins. So believe it or not, by the time they're 4 months of age, babies recognize and respond to their own names. They're responding to and sort of looking at the objects that they hear when they hear that are named by common words. So they're starting to understand language far earlier than we thought 5 or 10 years ago. They're not producing their first words till 10 to 14 months. There's a lot of variability there, and most of it's just completely within a typical range. It can even be a little earlier and quite a bit later, although they are, of course, babbling before that. On average, you'll start hearing short sentences of 2 or 3 words by 18 to 24 months, but acquisition actually begins even earlier than that. And it begins in perception. So perception is the gateway by which babies, of course, learn language. They're born ready to learn any language, but it's the native language or languages around them that they will be acquiring. And this listening begins even before birth. So the mother's voice is conducted through bone conduction. Voices in the world get across the womb more or less well, depending upon how many digestive noises are going on inside. And they're already, as you'll see, by birth, knowing a little bit about their native language. And of course, once they're born, you start interacting with them in this face-to-face interaction. And there's an enormous amount of information about language in the way you speak, the way you move your lips, the rhythm of your nodding of your head, etc. And this helps them as well. So bilingual babies, of course, I'm just going to change this. Okay. Bilingual babies haven't been studied. Bilingual acquisition hasn't been studied as much as monolingual acquisition. So most of the research on language acquisition has been done with monolingual babies. And unfortunately, the vast majority of it on English learning babies or babies in sort of really high-resourced countries. Yet, of course, more than half of the world is bi or multilingual. And it's incredibly important to understand how bilingual acquisition begins and how it unfolds, because growing up bilingual, you're learning, of course, 2 words for each object, perhaps 2 different word orders, 2 different kinds of things to talk about. And to really understand language acquisition, given that the majority of the world is probably bi or multilingual, we need to study bilingual and multilingual acquisition as well. And there is increasing research. So in this talk, I'm going to be addressing a series of questions. How do babies who are growing up bilingual get started from the very beginning, learning 2 languages at once? Do they confuse their 2 languages? A question we often hear. Are they delayed in language acquisition? Are there benefits, cognitive benefits from growing up bilingual? But I'm going to begin, well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about bilingualism, but throughout I will also have it peppered with a little bit of work on monolingual acquisition. Okay, what about languages in Canada? Well, the last census, the 2016 census, showed that people who reported an immigrant mother tongue rose from the 2011 census quite significantly by more than 13%. As well, there was an increase in the percentage of Canadians who reported more than 1 mother tongue being used in the home. That doesn't mean that the mother used the language. It means that it's a language that was used for babies from the beginning or is used in the home. Also, there was an increase in the percentage of Canadians who reported speaking more than 1 language at home. And in 2016, 7 in 10 people with a home language other than one of our official 2 languages spoke one of those other languages in the home. So the bilingualism is not predominantly the English and French, which are our 2 languages. And one of the other interesting things about Canada that I think was something we're very proud of is that there's a very high retention rate of heritage languages. So people continue speaking their heritage language at the same time that they're learning or is also speaking English. And this just shows you the retention rate across a number of commonly used languages in Canada. It's quite high. So what this creates then is a home environment where babies are growing up bilingual. In Vancouver, our most common other language is a Chinese language. Of course, there are multiple Chinese languages, Punjabi, Tagalog, Filipino language, etc. But we have, the list goes on and on and on. Babies who are growing up bilingual from birth, and that's what this talk is going to be about, are bilingual in lots of different ways. Andre here grew up learning Russian and English from his mother, English and pretty bad Russian from his father, but he also spent the weekends with his Russian grandparents. And now at age 14, he's quite fluent in both languages. Lavender grew up with Cantonese and English from her mother and only English from her father. And she's doing a pretty good job of holding on to her Cantonese because her mother works hard with her at it. And she has a younger sister, but it's more of a challenge without regular contact with a larger Cantonese speaking population. Sawa here was mostly Japanese, but some English from her mother as well. And now as a teenager, she's studying English and she's pretty good in both. And this is David, who grew up in Barcelona, where Catalan and Spanish are used all the time. On the streets, in the home, by pretty much everyone, or a large percentage of the population. And this is just some of the varieties of bilingual acquisition. And as you'll notice in many of these examples, it wasn't necessarily one parent, one language. And there's a lot of research now that shows that babies don't need that. That's not what you do. You speak what you speak well, and you speak to each other in the way you're most comfortable. And babies who grow up bilingual handle all of those different kinds of environments. So starting with what we know from monolingual babies, and this is some of the work that I started a long time ago. When babies are born, they're really citizens of the world, ready to learn any language. But as I said, they've already had a little bit of push from prenatal listening experience. So this is my granddaughter when she was a newborn. She was ready to learn any of the world's languages, but preferred listening to English. By the time she was 5 months, her knowledge of English, her perceptual understanding was bigger. And by the time she was a little over a year, she was well on her way to becoming an English-only speaker. A baby who's growing up bilingual will have been exposed to both languages from birth, still be ready to learn any of the world's languages, but already have a push to those 2 languages they heard in utero. And what's, I think, really important is by the time they're a year or a little bit older, they have good perceptual knowledge, ability to break into both of the native languages that they've been hearing from throughout the first year of life. They're specialists in the speech sound system of both of those languages and already using that to build a larger, more productive language system. And as you can see, there's still sensitivity, more sensitivity to similar languages than to unfamiliar ones. But so they grow up already by 12 months with a specialization in 2 languages rather than just one. Now, one of the domains in which we've shown this is in speech sound, phonetic discrimination. And so very little babies, very young babies, are able to discriminate speech sounds both from their native language and from an unfamiliar language. And we showed this first a million years ago, 1984. With English learning infants, listening to a speech sound distinction, two Ds, a dental da and a retroflex da, that are used to contrast meaning in Hindi, but not English. And as you can see, young English learning babies can discriminate this distinction, but by the time they're 10 to 12 months of age, just like English adults, they have a lot of difficulty. Whereas if they grow up with Hindi, they can continue to discriminate both of them. And this just shows one of the kinds of procedures that we might use to test that, where a baby learns to turn their head when they hear a sound change. And this kind of pattern has been shown for many, many, many other languages and sounds. So young English learning babies can discriminate Chinese tone differences that they can't by the time they're a year old. Japanese babies can discriminate ra-la when they're very young. They can no longer by the time they're a year old, and even for sign language. And I think what's really important here is that babies who are growing up bilingual maintain the ability to discriminate the distinctions used in both of their native languages. So the ba and pa boundary is different in English than in French. And by the time they're 12 to 14 months, babies who are growing up bilingual French-English can discriminate both the French ba difference and the English ba-pa difference. And so too for lots of other language sounds. Now, one of the big questions we get asked, I just want to make sure you got that. And they can also, what that shows you is they can also discriminate when somebody is speaking an English ba versus when they're speaking a French ba. And so even at the level of a single syllable, they can tell to some degree which language you're using. One of the questions that parents who speak more than one language at home are worried about is, do bilingual babies confuse their languages? Are they going to get mixed up? Is this going to make it hard for them to acquire language? So one of the studies that I'm kind of most proud of was led by a graduate student at the time, Krista Byers-Heinlein, in my lab, now a prof on her own at Concordia, where we tested brand new babies who had either been exposed to only, so neonates, only English in utero, or both Tagalog or Filipino and English in utero. And we asked whether already at birth they might show a preference for one of these languages over the other, and whether they could discriminate them. And what we used in this case was a sucking procedure, where babies suck on a pacifier, something they can do at birth. They'll change their sucking rate when they're interested, and amplitude, how hard they suck, when they're interested in something. And what we found is, whereas the English monolingual newborns sucked more to listen to English, the bilingual newborns sucked more to listen. They didn't suck more to one language or the other. They sucked equally to both of their familiar languages, but they sucked more to those languages than to an unfamiliar language, Mandarin. Yet, even though the bilingual babies were equally interested in listening to both of the languages that they could hear in utero, they were able to discriminate them. So even, within 4 hours after birth, which is how young we started testing these babies, if we played them repeatedly little sentences from one language and then switched to the other, even the bilingual babies discriminated the change and started sucking more and harder again. So they're born at birth. Babies are born with a preference for attending to, listening to a language that sounds familiar. For bilingual babies, that's both of the languages they heard in utero, but yet they're not confusing them. Even at birth, they're discriminating them, which allows them to begin tracking the properties of each. I think this is really important. So the protection from language confusion is in place at birth. Just a few other fun facts. Babies can even keep their languages apart by watching silent talking faces. So we showed babies videos of 3 fully bilingual French-English women reciting sentences from The Little Prince in either English or French. Let's say we did it in English first, and then we turned the sound off. And we just showed them, these engaging faces talking. And what we found is that the babies could discriminate, both bilingual and monolingual babies could discriminate the change in the same, watching these same women over and over again when they suddenly started speaking silently, just watching their faces, the other language. So from English to French or French to English, the babies started looking longer. So looking is another procedure that we use. They started watching those videos more again. And what was interesting is that both the monolingual and bilingual babies did this at 4 and 6 months of age. But by 8 to 10 months of age, babies who were growing up monolingual no longer showed evidence of discriminating their native language from an unfamiliar language just by watching silent talking faces, whereas the bilingual babies did. And even babies who were growing up with Spanish and Catalan, so not English and French, could still discriminate these 2 languages. So there's some evidence then that babies who are growing up bilingual pay a lot of attention to try to kind of figure out maybe what language is being spoken. Another fun fact that we think is pretty neat is that babies are so attentive to the world around them. And they rapidly learn the relation between ethnicity and language. So they can also use that cue to make a guess about who might be speaking what. Now in Vancouver, of course, the common experience for Vancouver babies is that if they see an East Asian face, an ethnic Chinese face, they don't know if they're going to hear a Chinese language or English. But if they see a European face, it's not very likely that they're going to hear a Chinese language. And for the Spanish language, they don't hear very much at all, and they don't really have a clue. And what we find is that by 10 months of age, babies know this. So when they hear English, they'll look to the European face. When they hear Mandarin or Cantonese, they'll look to the East Asian face. And when they hear Spanish, they don't know what to do. So it's those babies of yours are paying a lot of attention and learning a lot from the world around them, and it's helping to guide them in language acquisition.
Quick thing, Janet, they'll look to both faces equally for English.
That's right, Sav. They look to both faces equally when they hear Spanish. Yeah. Now, of course, if they were growing up in another part of the world, they might behave differently. But and I think this also shows that ethnicity isn't always a cue, but when it is a cue, babies use it. But toddlers do sometimes mix their language. And if you have toddlers mix their languages, you will have seen that. They're speaking in English and suddenly there's a word in Cantonese or in Spanish or whatever their other word is. So in this study, Genesee and colleagues tested 1- and 2-year-old French-English bilingual infant toddlers, and they videotaped them while they were interacting with monolingual strangers. And what they found is that infants changed their language depending upon the language of the stranger. So already, as soon as they start talking, if they're growing up bilingual and they experience somebody who only speaks English, well, they'll speak English to them as much as they can speak. And if the person only speaks French, they'll speak French to them. And this has been shown for a number of other languages as well. So they are keeping their languages separate, yet they are still mixing the words. So why do young bilinguals mix their languages? Well, in some ways, it's for the same reason that bilingual adults mix their languages, because we do code switching too. Sometimes there isn't a word for it in the other language. Sometimes if you're a little toddler, maybe you haven't learned it yet. And so it gets inserted from the other language. as I mentioned, the people around them do code switching, mix their languages as well. And the other thing that Genesee and colleagues showed is that by the time they're 3 or 4, children's amount of mixing is a function of the mixing of their families and communities. So if they're growing up in a bilingual community where people are switching back and forth between their languages all the time, including within a sentence, a child will do that as well. If they grow up in a community where people, speak one language or the other, they mix less as well. And so they're learning the social rules about language use. It's showing them very early. And so on the basis of these findings, the research community has interpreted this to show that they're not confused. They're doing what they need to do to communicate. So other questions we get? Are bilingual babies delayed in acquisition? No, they're not. They learn words at the same pace. Their vocabulary might be smaller in each language up to some certain age, but across their 2 languages, not just the number of words. So it's not just having a word in each language, but the number of concepts that are encoded in words is larger in most studies in bilingual babies. They start combining words into 2-word sentences at about the same time. There's variability. So, any individual study might show evidence that bilinguals are doing something a little bit later, and another study will show that they're doing it a little bit earlier. Across meta-analyses of numbers of studies, it seems to be at about the same age. They are no more likely to have a language learning disability than our monolingual children. So the percentage of children who have some kind of language disability is around 10%, 8 to 12% across studies. It's equal in babies growing up monolingual or trilingual as it is in babies growing up, babies growing up bilingual or trilingual as it is in babies growing up monolingual. But unfortunately, sometimes when a child growing up bilingual or multilingual has a language delay, even their doctor might tell the family that it's because of bilingualism. It isn't. The statistics are identical. And even children who are on the autism spectrum, there is increasing research that shows that they too can handle growing up with 2 languages in the home. And it might give them a little bit even of a leg up in the kinds of cognitive reasoning that they might have otherwise have difficulties with. But there are some aspects of language acquisition that bilingual and monolingual children learn differently, of language that bilingual and monolingual children learn differently. And I could go through a lot of these. And what they are differences. They're not delays. They're not disability. It's what it is a function of making sense out of the worlds that they're growing up in. So for example, one kind of difference that isn't in this talk, but a monolingual baby, if they know, cup of a grandchild, I'll show you the other side. If they know the word for cup and they see this and they don't know the word for this object and they hear a word like lift, they'll assume that it refers to the second object. A baby growing up bilingual, unless you let them know what language you're speaking in, doesn't know if that's going to be another label for cup. And so they'll consider the possibility that that's another label for cup before checking out whether it's a label for this different object. And they use a lot of information like who's talking to me, what's the context. Both monolingual and bilingual babies can use these same reasoning heuristics, but when they use them varies, and what comes first varies. Another difference is they differ in how they treat mispronunciations of known words. So if monolinguals hear the word ball, they look to this object rather than that object. But if they hear the mispronunciation bow, they look to the unfamiliar object. Well, these kinds of studies have also been done in bilingual learning infants. And if they grow up in a bilingual home, especially one where both pronunciations exist, maybe because they're cognates, they're similar sounding words across their two languages, like might be the case in Spanish and Italian, or maybe because one of their parents uses accented speech from the other language, then they might look to ball even when they hear bow. But again, if they're first given information as to which language is being used, this is an English speaker right now, or this isn't an English speaker, they can be very exacting in their expectations. So they're learning language in the same way, but they're also more open to the variation that they've heard and paying a lot of attention to who might be talking now and how is that going to help guide me. What's interesting is that both monolinguals and bilinguals will accept a mispronunciation from a speaker of an unfamiliar ethnicity. So if this is their familiar ethnicity and they see a European speaker, they'll allow her to mispronounce the word. So it's, again, they know something about that there are different languages used by different peoples. One of the kinds of, not one of my favorite facts about infant development is that babies are also more reluctant to learn a word from a speaker of an unfamiliar ethnicity. But this is easily remedied. If they're first shown, this is some of Drew Weatherhead's work, if they're first shown a friendly interaction between a speaker of an unfamiliar ethnicity and someone from the ethnicity they know that they're most familiar with, then they're happy to learn a word from that person. And there's some emerging evidence, it's not really published yet, that indicates, that bilingual infants are less skeptical toward and more open to learning from speakers of different languages and cultures. Now that may just reflect their experience at home, but it's kind of neat. Okay, are bilingual babies delayed in language acquisition? No, I already said this before, but we already had this slide. Sorry, I'm going the wrong direction now. Okay, I don't know what my computer's doing. Okay, are there advantages to growing up bilingual? And I'm sure you've read this in the literature, and I've gone through some advantages, but I don't think that the kinds of advantages that I've gone through mean that being bilingual is better than being monolingual, or some of the other differences don't mean that being monolingual is better than being bilingual. What they show is that babies adapt to and manage well the environments that they're growing up in. But still, there might be some advantages over and above that. And some people, of course, there's the obvious advantage of having more than one language. It's a gift to give your child if they can have more than one language. They can understand the world in different ways. They can talk to their grandparents, perhaps, whatever. But there also is evidence that bilingual babies might pay more careful attention, as I've been saying throughout, to who is talking, how they are talking. They even watch the mouth more when they're watching speakers, and they use that information. And there is some evidence that bilingual in infants and toddlers might be more flexible, actually, in word learning and problem solving. And this is more controversial. So this is, I'm just going to go through this really quickly. If a baby is shown a white square and then they hear a sound of one type or another, let's say a sequence of two syllables that are the same followed by a third one, that they're taught that means that there will be a little display on one side. All babies, monolingual and bilingual, can learn that. What bilingual babies are reported in some studies to do better is to switch. Now that same rule means, oh, they're going to get to see something interesting on the other side. And there's some evidence that bilingual babies do that switching of the rule they've learned better than do monolingual babies. And this is at 6 and 10 months of age. But that evidence does not always replicate. We do see that they track the language they're hearing and how that language might be being produced more carefully than do monolingual infants, and they continue doing that. But whether there are these other kinds of cognitive advantages, the research is still not clear. But what is clear is that in these kinds of language, in these kinds of rule switching tasks, different brain systems are being used. And this is another kind of study when our labs are open again, you'll be able to participate in, where we record brain activity from babies. And what this work shows is that when bilingual babies are doing rule switching in comparison to monolingual babies, just like bilingual adults and children, they might use different systems. And what's really kind of interesting from the older children, we're getting some hints of this in little babies, is that attention systems for switching what to pay attention to outside of language are kind of more likely to be in the right hemisphere in monolinguals. Well, with bilinguals, they're more likely to be in the left hemisphere. And that's where language is. And people hypothesize that this may come from having to keep track of what language is being used, and that it may give them a different attentional system, maybe a boost in how to switch, not just in language to keep track of that, but what rule to use at any particular time. So you have to stay tuned for developments. So in summary, we're learning more and more about babies growing up bilingual or multilingual. We're learning that they're able to keep their two languages separate from the get-go and track the properties and words of each. They learn, I didn't mention this from the very beginning, these translation equivalents, that this object is called cup in English and some other word in their other language. And that's a cue as well to who's speaking and when. They don't confuse their languages, but they still do code switch. And the amount that they code switch is consistent with the code switching of the people that they're talking to. They are not delayed in language acquisition. They acquire their languages at the same rate and in many of the same ways as do monolingual babies. And there might be cognitive benefits from growing up bilingual. And there certainly are influences on exactly how the brain solves some of the same tasks. So that's it. Thanks to all of us from the UBC Early Development Research Group. Time for our questions and answers, for your questions and my attempt to answer. So Sav, I'll let you moderate.
Great, fantastic. All right. Our most upvoted question is by anonymous attendee. What is the best approach to teach 3 or more languages, and at what age?
Right. So there's been even less work on trilingual acquisition. The studies that have been done for babies who are growing up with 3 or more languages in the home indicate that, they also acquire 3 languages. What's different is that it's unlikely that you're going to have equal amount of input in each of the 3 languages. And as you might imagine, babies acquire best that which they hear and experience the most. So they might be better in Mandarin and English than they are in Cantonese, if those are the 3 languages in the home, or have more words or whatever. hasn't been studied as much is teaching, and that's what your question is. What is the best approach to teaching, to helping them learn multiple languages? If the languages are in your home, it's natural language acquisition, and you just want to make sure that they're used enough and a lot. So talk to the babies a lot, give them the opportunity to talk to multiple speakers of each of the languages, if that's possible. Teaching multiple languages, there's the work on early immersion, like in daycare, is babies and toddlers learn, it's less consistent. They learn the dominant language of the culture. They pick that up very early. And it's hard sometimes to keep them speaking the home language. But whether they'll learn like another unfamiliar language, if it's not used at home, there are inconsistent results on how long that's maintained. And teaching multiple languages, I'm afraid is something that's outside of my domain of expertise, but certainly it's something that we as humans are capable of learning multiple languages. And early exposure can make a big difference. And of course, motivation as they get older.
Thank you, Janet. So once I mentioned votes, then the votes started really coming in, which is great. Thank you, everybody. So now the top question is, at what age does it become difficult to learn a new language that an infant's never been exposed to before?
Right. So that's a great question. Certainly, the older you get, the harder it gets. There are individual differences. Some people maintain the ability to learn another language well into adulthood. I mean, we all do, but it's how well we learn it, how likely we are to be accent free, how likely we are to not have those little grammatical errors, how likely we are to remember enough words. This is called the critical period. Is there a critical period for second language acquisition? And it appears that after about age 7 or 8, it gets harder to get the very subtle features of grammar right. After 11 or 12, you're much more likely to have an accent the rest of your life. Who cares? But what's really interesting is that even in early infancy, the earliest exposure makes a difference. So there is some work with, well, I don't need to go into that. So people are faster at processing the languages that they heard first, but you're still quite capable of learning a second language up to probably 12, 14, 15, even into your 20s. But the older you are, the more likely you are to have an accent, to have those little subtle difficulties. I hope that answers your question.
Awesome. The next two questions are related. They're two sides of the same coin. So going back to that question we get all the time, Janet, the one parent, one language method of teaching your children multiple languages. So one parent is asking, should we be consistent with what language we use with our child? And the other parent is asking, is it okay if I'm not consistent? So
right, great. So the one parent, one language hypothesis actually came from somebody named Leopold in the late 1800s or early 1900s. He wrote this, and everybody came to believe it. And it's depending on the home, it's really hard. If both parents, you want to have the best thing for children is to grow up in a language learning environment where language is used naturally and richly and directed toward children. And most likely it's going to be the case that it isn't consistent. So even if one parent, it's hard to be married, it's hard to be two parents when you don't speak any overlapping language. So typically you're going to overlap a little bit. And so it's hard to do one parent, one language when you speak to the child and also speak to one another across a table. If you're both bilingual, you can try to do that, but there really isn't any evidence that babies need that. And so they really are able to track the properties of each of their languages separately. And the more they learn about each language, the more they build for greater learning. Oh, that's an English word. Oh, that's a little English sentence structure. Or that's a tone difference. That's Mandarin. They don't, so no, it is okay to not do one parent, one language. There are differences. There are some tiny little consequences, but there are consequences to doing one parent, one language as well. And so, as I mentioned in the talk, babies learn how to use language in their community. So if you use one parent, one language, children will talk to you in that way. And so that might be a way to help keep them using a second language if that's the only way that parent will speak to them. On the other hand, if you mix your languages, they'll mix their languages too when they're talking to you, but in a rule-governed way. It doesn't show confusion. It's just, this is what we do at home. If you use one language to talk about getting ready for dinner and another language to talk about when you're reading books, that's what they'll do too. And so, although they'll show some more flexibility than that. So no, they don't need you to do one parent, one language. Now, if you have been trying to do one parent, one language up to now, and now after this lecture, you go home and say, I don't have to do this, you might want to change gradually because your child might be surprised to suddenly hear you speaking that other language. So, give them a little hint and a little time to adjust. But no, they don't need that.
Thank you, Janet. 2 questions related to hard of hearing or deaf infants. So I'll give them to you just at once. One of them is, I have an infant who's hard of hearing. Is it better to stick to one language, or is it okay to expose them to 2 languages? And then the other question is about, well, how does this all work with sign language?
Right. Okay. So there hasn't been as much work on bilingual acquisition in hard of hearing infants as there should be. So I don't want to, make people feel comfortable if it's not evidence-based. I suspect from all the work that's been done with special populations that it's probably not an additional challenge to learn more than one language if you're hard of hearing than it is if you're not, except that, there's of course the challenge of tracking the sound properties. Typically, and I think that's why this is related to the other question, typically there will be some kind of augmentation through a hearing aid, or if the family chooses, there will be a cochlear implant that will, again, boost the signal. And so I think that enough of the signal is probably going to get in that one shouldn't avoid bilingualism, even with if your child is hard of hearing. They're going to track which language you're using, but as I mentioned, more language needs to be done. What is clear, and super clear from the research, is that babies can grow up as bimodal bilinguals. So what that means, that is that if they're hard of hearing, or one of the parents is primarily a signer because they have hearing difficulties, or for whatever reason, babies can grow up with a signed and a spoken language from birth. And just because you're giving them a sign language, it's not going to interfere with their acquisition of a spoken language any more than having, French and English. French doesn't interfere with acquisition of English, and English doesn't interfere with acquisition of French. acquisition of a sign language does not interfere with acquisition of a spoken language if the baby, has the capacity to get that language in. What does interfere with acquisition of a spoken language is not giving them a sign language and not giving them augmentation. If there's not a way that you can make a child hear, the statistics are something like 1 child in 80 to 100 can learn to speak from lip reading alone. So giving them a sign language as well as a spoken language is the best thing that you can do for your child too, or only a sign language. But if you want them to acquire a spoken language, giving them a sign language as well as a spoken language is the best thing that you can do. Does that address the sign language question, or did you have a specific question about sign language acquisition?
I can read the question itself out. Let me see if I can find it here.
And I hope that answer was clear. Okay.
Our
Babies can also, there's also been work that babies can grow up with 2 sign languages. If all they get is a sign language, they can be bilingual in sign too. But
the question was, are babies learning English and Spanish at home as well as sign language? How might the sign language affect language development? I think you really touched.
Yeah, it's not going to interfere with it. Yeah. And in fact, it's going to help it, because getting language in gets those language systems that are waiting for language working. And that's where there is a very, very unequivocal evidence for a critical period. If you don't get some language in when the brain is expecting it early in development, it's much harder to acquire a language later. And so that's unequivocal.
So, quick thing for Tina, code switch is to simply switch between your languages. It's another word for language mixing. Okay, we're coming up on 2, so I'll feed Janet just a few more questions and squeeze them in here. I often hear that bilingual toddlers take a bit longer to start speaking, or that their total number of words span across both languages. I do think Janet touched a lot on this during her talk. The question is, how can I tell if my bilingual toddler's language development is delayed or if it's on track for a multilingual?
Yeah, I mean, that's super difficult. In fact, I mean, if it is delayed, it's not delayed because they're bilingual. I think that's the first thing that a parent needs to know. There is so much variability in early language acquisition. And I said, the first child begins producing words between 10 and 14 months. Well, my second grandson started producing words at around 20 months. And he was not babbling very much either. And it's not unusual for little boys, especially, although it happens with little girls too, to be way out on the tails of those distributions. And it's very hard to tell until they're 2.5 or older whether they have a language delay. So it's really hard. I think the best thing to do is, if you are concerned, that the more critical cues very early on are, is the child making eye contact? Are they trying to communicate with you? Do they want to share information even if they're not using spoken language for it? Do they seem to understand what you're saying? And if all of those things are on track, things are probably going to be okay. But if you're really worried, ask your doctor. If your doctor says poo-poo and you're still really worried, push and get a referral to a speech language pathologist for early intervention, because some kids do need a little bit of a boost to get moving. It's not going to be because they're bilingual. You may be told that it's because they're bilingual. But as I mentioned in the talk, the incidence of language delay and language disability is identical in bilingual as well as monolingual learning kids. So it does happen in bilingual learning kids, but not because of bilingualism. It happens to the same degree it does in monolingual. So if you're concerned, get in there and talk to them, get their ears checked. Maybe they're having middle ear infections. Get a referral and push to get that referral, even if somebody says, oh, don't worry, if you're really worried.
All right. Last question, I think. So this attendee has a bilingual 2-year-old, Vietnamese and English. But the parent's Vietnamese is elementary school level or worse. And so the parent doesn't have the vocabulary to discuss more complex topics. So once her daughter is older, how should she handle discussing more complex topics? Should she switch to English?
That's a great question. Yeah. I mean, the same question happens for if you have a deaf child and you're not a hard of hearing child, and you're not a signer and you've learned sign language as an adult, it's pretty rudimentary. If you want that other language to be kept to grow, then you have to bring other Vietnamese speakers into your home who can talk to the child about more complex subjects in Vietnamese. I hate to say switch to English because it's, I just hate to say that. Maybe you can find a place to keep building your own Vietnamese as an adult so that you can learn along with your child. But certainly what you don't want to model is I wouldn't worry so much about the words. You can probably look them up. You can do the code switching. If you don't have the word in Vietnamese, you can use it in English. They're not going to get confused. Or you can speak in English. Or you maybe can find Vietnamese books to read. It's you don't want to give your child grammatically incorrect English. Grammatically incorrect Vietnamese. If there were a lot of other Vietnamese speakers around, it would be okay if you gave grammatically incorrect Vietnamese or grammatically incomprehensible. They would figure it out from the other speakers. But if you're the only one, you might have to do that. Boo-hoo.
Well, this will be a short one, I think, Janet, maybe then
Okay.
on a lighter note. This is my mother-in-law, Barb. Hi, Barb. How do these findings pertain to grandparents' efforts to help babies of toddlers be bilingual rather than parents themselves?
Right. It depends. So if grandma or grandpa is with the child a lot, is a caregiver, and speaks a different language, or if, and let's go back to the last question. I know your mother-in-law isn't a Vietnamese speaker, Sav, but suppose she were, that would be an opportunity to keep that second language building and growing in complexity if the mother didn't have that capability. Babies are less willing to learn a language from somebody they don't see that often. One of the kind of sad things in the research is that sometimes they'll learn a second language from a nanny, but often they won't, even if the nanny doesn't speak the language that the parents use. They'll understand it, but they won't speak it unless somehow it's made really clear this person's part of the family. So for grandparents to help out, I think they have to build on something that's already in the home, unless they're like seeing the child, as I said, regularly, perhaps living together, being a regular caregiver. And then when the kid gets a little bit older, and if somehow they've developed an interest in an additional language, and some children very much want to learn an additional language, then grandparents can help. Even if it's a language that wasn't already in the home. And believe it or not, they can even do that online if a relationship is established already.
Wonderful. Thank you, Janet.